Hello and welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about overdraft defenseman candidates, and specifically which defensemen significantly overperformed last season. This channel is about strategy and all about maximizing value, and players who overperformed last season may get overdrafted and therefore won't return much value to your team if you draft them early. So just an introduction, in order to maximize the value that you want in your draft, you have to understand some players are going to be overdrafted and some players are going to return a lot more value. Today we're going to be looking at point per game data, much like we did in the last video, which will give us a general sense of a defenseman's offensive production numbers, but not necessarily their impact on the game in other ways. For hits and blocks, you can refer to my strategy video on that in my data draft playlist. I believe that was rule number 4. And for an overall defenseman strategy, that was rule number 2 in my draft strategy series, and you can find that in the same playlist as well. But for today, just what we mentioned last time, in order to maximize the value, you have to understand overdraft and buy low candidates, what that means. And if you watched the last video, you have a better sense of what that means. And again, not all players in this data set are due for a regression. In fact, most of them aren't, especially with the defensemen, because there's a lot fewer defensemen that are primed for an overdraft type of situation. But they do tend to go a little bit earlier in drafts, especially because people understand that defensemen who put up points are more rare. So it is worth mentioning and worth going into the data on this. But one difference between this data set and the one we did for the forwards is that there aren't as many of them, and I can go into a bit more detail on each player that we highlight. But you absolutely need to keep your overall strategy in mind when looking at this information. So in my previous videos, I suggested that you need 2 elite power play quarterback defensemen, one guy to add some point totals, some shots, and hits and blocks, and then a straight hits and blocks guy if you're in a hits and blocks league. If you're in a plus-minus league, then maybe you go that direction with your D3. But typically, your 4th defenseman should be a hits guy because he's going to provide you with a lot more value at that position than trying to get a hits forward who's going to reduce the value that you can gain because they're not going to be putting up as many points. And you definitely want your offense to put up points. So what we're looking at today is point per game data compared to a 5-year average for point per game data for each player, which will only help you analyze which of these 2 elite offensive defensemen to choose, and possibly your 3rd defenseman if you try to go that route as opposed to the hits and blocks route. But the main takeaway from all of this data is that you have to apply a strategy with it. You can't just look at this and say, oh, this player sucks or that player is good, because it's not that simple, and you want to make sure that you're maximizing value for your team, and in order to do that, you need a strategy. But if you do have the strategy, or if you've watched my previous videos and you kind of agree with the strategy that I've been peddling, this is the data, and we've gone over this in the last video. But for the defensemen, the minimum threshold to make these lists was 0.4 points per game average. That was around 50% lower than the highest rated defenseman in each set. So it gives us a general idea of fantasy relevance. And again, as we go into the data, it's important to remember that scoring was up last season from 5.9 goals per game in 2021 to 6.3 in 21-22. And most of the 2010s, we were at around 5.5 goals per game. So just want to keep that in mind because a lot of these guys are not necessarily overdraft candidates. They're more, more along the lines of guys that were beneficiaries of that increase in scoring. But as we bring over the data set, this is the defenseman. So in the future videos, in the next couple days, I'll be doing buy low forwards and buy low defensemen. And there's a lot less of them because obviously with the increase in scoring, there's going to be a lot more players who overproduced last year compared to their usual 5-year average. And again, this data breaks down into basic, 2 categories. So it's young up-and-coming players who have a potential to continue the production that they've put up, and then you've got guys who overproduced. And to be honest, there weren't that many guys who overproduced. So before we get into the overproducers, I'm going to start with the up-and-comers. And you can see Aaron Ekblad up here, 0.93 points per game, 0.61 is his 5-year average. So he had a pretty good increase over his usual 5-year point per game average, 57 points last year. It's probably repeatable if he can stay healthy. So the previous 3 seasons, he's played 61 games, 35 games, and 67 games. Obviously, for a defenseman of his caliber, you'd prefer to have him playing closer to 82, but it's just not possible given, I guess, the injury-prone nature that he's had over the past couple seasons. But one thing to note, I saw his goal per game numbers from 2 years ago, which was .31 goals per game. And if you combine every season that a defenseman has had over the last 5 years, he ranked 5th in the highest goal per game season in the last 5 years. The other guys on that list, Dumba was number 1, Makar was number 2, Chychrun was 3rd, Werenski was 4th, and Ekblad was 5th. And then his goal per game numbers from last season ranked 11th on that ranking system. So he's a guy who's going to be goal heavy, which is definitely preferable to a guy who's assist heavy. So if you're looking at him or Adam Fox, I would maybe go him unless you favor games played as opposed to overall production, because Fox tends to stay a little bit healthier than Ekblad, and he'll play more games and put up more total points and probably get more power play points as well. But Ekblad is a goal-scoring defenseman, which is relatively rare in this league. And although he doesn't have necessarily the goal numbers that guys like Josi and Makar had last year, he is a guy who will score goals per game for you, and the numbers aren't there necessarily in the grand scheme of things because of his injury history. So just something to keep in mind there. As we move down this list, Devon Toews, obviously he has the Makar garden seat, and he does have an overall trend in the right direction. So he had 18 points, then 28 points, then 31 points, and then last season 57 points. Now some of those earlier numbers were with the Islanders, so a much less offensive team, and he is more assist heavy, but he did have 13 goals, which is respectable for a D-man. As long as he's going to be on the same defensive pairing with Cale Makar, I would definitely look at him, but I'd probably look at him as a D3 because, again, he's not getting that power play time. Anybody on this list who doesn't get power play time, you're going to think of them more in that D3, D4 range because, again, you need your top 2D to quarterback elite power plays. So just something to keep in mind in that range as well. So as we look a little bit further down, Noah Dobson, he's a young up-and-coming defenseman, 51 points in 80 games. He stayed healthy, which is something that Ekblad has not been able to do. Obviously, the production isn't as prolific as Ekblad, but 7 points in his first season, 14 in his second, and then 51 last year. He had 22 power play points last year. It all depends who Lane Lambert wants on that power play unit because Pulock used to be there, but Dobson did really well on it when Pulock was hurt last year, so he may get the nod this season, but just monitor that situation in training camp. If they're not using him on the power play, then he's probably not fantasy relevant yet. Although, one thing to note, he did average 1.925 blocks per game, so he was getting some offensive production, especially on the power play, and he did get some blocks. So that could be a guy you look at as a D3 because he's still going to get you power play production, offensive production in general, and he's going to add blocks, although he doesn't hit a ton. But just wanted to go over that file really quick. Bowen Byram, there's just not enough data. So it looks bad. It looks like he overproduced compared to normal, but he's only got 2 years of data. In year one, he played 19 games, had 2 points, so not much to write home about. He did have some mental health issues and some injury troubles with concussions and whatnot. But then year two, 30 games, 17 points. So that's a big jump from year one to year two. And we saw what he could do in the finals. He was one of the best defensemen for Colorado in the finals last season. So you can see it with the eye test. The obvious problem, he doesn't quarterback that power play. Makar quarterbacks that power play and probably will for the rest of eternity. Like Bowen Byram is not going to get an opportunity there. And even if Makar got hurt, I would venture a guess that they would probably start Toews or Girard in that spot over Byram. Although he could get a look, it's just not a guarantee. It's not one of those situations where if Makar goes down, he's obviously the next guy in line. But he does have pretty decent numbers, and he did have pretty decent goal numbers per game. I think he had 5 goals in 30 games. So if you prorate that, he's a 12 to 15 goal guy per season, and that's mostly even strength. So again, a D3, D4 caliber option here with Bowen Byram, but he's an up-and-coming player, not necessarily a guy due for a regression. A relatively younger player who might be due for a regression is Kylington. He's one of those guys who benefited from an increase in ice time last year. He had 8 points in 38 games a couple years ago, then 7 points in 48 games, and then took a jump last year to 31 points in 73 games. But the Flames brought in Mackenzie Weegar. They still have Rasmus Andersson. They still have Hanifin, and all of those guys are more likely to put up better seasons this year based on ice time and track record. So I might fade Kylington a little bit here, but he probably won't get drafted that high either. Another thing to note, just wanted to mention him really quickly. Sami Niku, again, not a guy that's going to get overly drafted. Just trying to find my notes on him here. He's trending in the right direction for points per game. He had 0.13 points per game, 0.29 the next year, and then last year 0.46. So trending in the right direction in terms of points per game, but trending in the wrong direction in games played. So he had 30 games, then 17 games, and then 13 games. And obviously he changed teams from Winnipeg going to Montreal. But he's probably not going to get drafted. Just wanted to comment on this weird little data anomaly and see, why he was up here so high in terms of his overall overproduction compared to previous seasons. He's trending in the right direction point per game wise, but he's trending the opposite way in ice time. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in general on Montreal's blue line this season. But obviously, I probably wouldn't go to this guy if you're looking for any real category coverage. But some of these guys, as we go, obviously the more risk is the guys up at the top of this data set. The guys who are closer to the bottom, this is, again, like I mentioned in the previous video, this is probably due to an increase in scoring. A lot of these guys are just marginally above their 5-year average. But some of these guys are due for a regression, and I guess it's time to talk about these guys. And the number one guy who's due for a regression is Roman Josi. I love this player, but there has to be regression here. He had 1.2 points per game for a defenseman, which is insane. The only players to put up a better offensive season as a defenseman, not point per game wise, but total points, the only guys to do it at a better rate than Josi are Bobby Orr, Paul Coffey, Al McInnes, Brian Leach, Dennis Potvin, and Phil Housley. And every one of those seasons where one of these Hall of Fame defensemen outpaced Josi, every one of those seasons happened at least 30 years ago. So almost before Josi was born. Josi was born in 90. And the last one of these seasons where a defenseman put up more than 95 points was in 92-93. Josi has had a 0.7 point per game, 0.68, 0.94, 0.68, and then a 1.2 point per game in the last 5 years. And if you notice, he took a dip after the 0.94 point per game season, and he dropped to 0.68. So there is historical precedent for him regressing again. But the biggest reason to stay away from Josi this year has nothing to do with the player and more to do with where he will likely go in drafts. Usually, and I got him last year in the 5th or 6th round, and he was incredible value there. And typically that's where I've been seeing him in drafts because Nashville isn't necessarily a sexy team to try to pluck from. But this year, with the numbers that he put up last year, he will probably be going in the top 30. And of course, that means that you will be getting less value from him, on top of the fact that he was probably the most likely candidate due for a regression. Now, even if he does regress, he's still probably, if you split the difference between 0.85 and 1.2, he's about a point per game defenseman. So he's still incredibly valuable. And again, if you keep the strategy in mind, he's a power play quarterback, elite offensive defenseman, and he's a guy that you definitely do want on your team, especially for the fact that he was second in defenseman goal scoring last year. I believe he had 23 goals. So still a really good player. Even if he does regress, he's still a great fantasy option. But just don't reach too much to try to get him. Don't draft him in the first round. Don't draft him early in the second round. There's way too much talent there. If he does drop below the 20 to 25 range, then he's starting to become fantasy ownable, and able to provide you value there. The next guy probably due for a regression, Rasmus Andersson. Usually a 0.3 point per game guy. He was up to 0.6 last year, 50 points. So he's trending up over the past 5 seasons. 0.24 points per game, 0.31, 0.375, and then a 0.6. But there's a large almost doubling of his production from 2021 to 21-22, and I believe a lot of that was due to power play production, as last year he had 19 power play points. Compare that to 6, 4, and 2 in the previous 3 seasons. So he got a big bump from quarterbacking that power play, and I'm not sure if Andersson or Weegar will be getting the bulk of the power play time for Calgary this year. So unless you know that, and if you're a diehard Calgary Flames fan and you know that they prefer Andersson there, then maybe you can bank on that inside info. But and I would definitely look at training camp and see if he's still the guy quarterbacking the power play, because if he is, he might be fantasy relevant again. But he is still due for a regression because he kind of never puts up more than half a point per game average, and he did so last year. So he's one of those overproducers who every year that we can look at the data from over the past 5, he's been way below what he did last year, and he popped off last year, largely because of opportunity. And that opportunity might be a little bit limited this season. So he's a guy who's primed for a little bit of a regression. And then same type of thing, but as I was talking about with Josi, Victor Hedman is probably due for a little bit of a regression, but it's hard to say. Usually 0.85 points per game over the last 5 lists. This past year, 1.03. And in his previous 5 seasons, 0.81, 0.77, 0.83, 0.83 again, and then a 1.03. So he's in that range of 0.77 to 0.83 points per game every season. But last year he took off, and I believe some of that was due to the increase in scoring. But if you look at the eye test, he should be able to continue this production as Kucherov will finally be healthy this year. Point should be healthy at some point this season, and they are returning a lot of the pieces on that lethal power play that he quarterbacks. So there's obvious familiarity there with his D partner, with his defensive scheme, with the power play unit, etc. The only thing that scares me away from Hedman is that he's played 273 games over the last 3 regular season and playoffs combined. So he's not getting much time in the offseason to recover and train the way that you would if you didn't constantly go to the finals. So it's a little bit nitpicky, but there's not much to not like about Victor Hedman. He's obviously going to be one of those elite defensemen that's chosen pretty early. He's usually a really safe bet. I would expect maybe a little bit of regression just because of the fact that he was above a point per game last year, and he usually isn't, but he could obviously repeat this. It's not out of the realm of possibility. I think Josi repeating a 1.2 point per game season is a lot less likely. That was a season where, I've mentioned this in a previous video, he should have won the Norris in my opinion, just given that season that he had. Hedman is more replicatable, but I don't know what to make of how much time he's played over the past 3 years, and the fact that the Tampa Bay Lightning probably don't care about the regular season anymore. They've been to the finals the last 3 years, so regular season production isn't important to them, or isn't as important to them as it would be for a team that hasn't won a cup. So just something to keep in mind with Victor Hedman. Another guy on this list that might get faded a little bit is Justin Faulk. So 0.42 is his 5-year average, 0.61 last season, so he's up a little bit, 47 points, and a lot of that was goals. So he had 16 goals last year. But if you look at his point per game numbers over the last 5, 0.4, 0.42, 0.23, 0.44, and then a 0.61. So he's usually in that 0.4 range, but he's deviated both above and below that number, which means that he's a little bit less predictable when you're looking at his averages. And then, again, because he had 16 goals, you might think of him as a goal-scoring defenseman. But if you look at his goals per game over the last 5 seasons, 0.10, 0.13, 0.07, 0.125, and then a 0.21. So he almost doubled his previous high in goals per game. He did take a big jump in that category last year, and he had 7 power play points last year. But with a healthy Torrey Krug, I'd expect Krug to get more of that power play one time, but just monitor the situation, because if Krug loses that job, maybe Faulk becomes a waiver wire candidate. And then the other thing to mention about Justin Faulk is he shoots the puck a lot. So he had 2.19 shots per game last year and 16 goals. So he could be a guy you look at as a D3 just for shots and goals. If you're going to try to corner the market on those categories and there's no real elite offensive power play defenseman left, he could be a guy to just get you those two categories. But he is probably due for a little bit of a regression off those numbers from last season. Another guy that I kind of wanted to talk about in a couple of different ways is Charlie McAvoy. For offensive categories, at least, his .56 5-year average is nothing to write home about. He's not elite in that perspective, but .71 last year, and then he's trending in the right direction to an extent. .50, .51, .47, .58, and then a .71 point per game average. So the last 3 seasons he's been trending up. He's been getting that power play one time, but he's due for a little bit of a regression to his average, seeing as how he's mostly around that half a point per game mark. And then on top of that, he's going to be starting the season hurt and isn't expected back until December. The difference is what makes McAvoy valuable is his all-around play. So in addition to that .71 point per game average, he also gets 2.12 shots per game. He had 21 power play points last year, 1.98 hits per game, and 1.65 blocks per game. So if you're looking at that, that would be an absolute elite, maybe best case scenario D3. He could be considered a D2 because of his power play exposure, but at the same time, he's not going to be starting the season, so you're going to have to stash him on IR for quite a while. I wouldn't jump too high to pick him because of that. But if he starts falling in your draft, that could be a strategy that you have where you stash him on the IR, and when Boston tries to make a push in the second half of the season, when they finally get healthy, remember, they brought back Krejci. Bergeron's back again. They added Pavel Zacha to the mix, who's a little bit more skillful than Erik Haula, although Haula had a really good season last year. But once they get healthy and they start firing on all cylinders towards the second half of the year, he could be good fantasy value, especially during your fantasy playoff time, as he'll probably be more fresh than some of the other defensemen out there, only playing or after missing 2 of the months of the beginning of the season. So just a cautionary advisory: don't pick him too high and expect him to be an elite power play quarterback, because his numbers are due for a little bit of a regression offensively speaking, although he will probably still shoot the puck, he'll probably still hit and block shots, and he will probably still get power play time. So he could be an excellent D3 candidate if you can get him a little bit later in the draft. So maybe after the 5th round, if he's still hanging in that range, you could go that route. But it is a little bit difficult because there are a lot of good offensive options in that range. So it really just depends on what you want to do in terms of your blue line. Another guy I kind of wanted to talk about was some of these younger players that are entering into some of their best years. Now, Mackenzie Weegar, not incredibly young, but he doesn't have a lot of a track record necessarily in the NHL, as he was kind of a minor league player for a while and then kind of hit it in the last couple seasons. Last year, he was 120th in hits per game, but he was top 20 in blocks. And he does produce a bit offensively. I mentioned him in one of my other videos for that purpose. One of my subscribers asked if he would be similar to Trouba and Nurse in that D3 hits and blocks kind of category. So that's why I did that analysis and found that he was not the best option for hits, but top 20 in blocks. He is a little bit of assist heavy, 44 points in 80 games last year, which is 0.55 points per game. He had a 0.66 point per game the year before, 0.4 before that, and 0.23 before that. So he's trending in the right direction. But he just changed teams, and he'll have to adjust to a more defensive Daryl Sutter system. And he'll likely regress a little bit as a result of that and leaving the best offensive team in the league. So the offensive production will likely regress a little bit, but you're still picking him up for his other category coverage, mainly blocks and a little bit of hit coverage as well. Adam Fox, since we went over some of the other elite offensive defensemen, he had a 0.94 point per game average last year, up from his average of 0.80. But he's a guy who has trended in the right direction every season. So he had a 0.6 point per game rookie season, his 0.85 point per game Norris Trophy season, and then increased that to .94 last year and didn't come close to the Norris because of the incredible seasons of Josi and Makar. He's obviously very assist and power play heavy. He doesn't score a ton of goals, but he did have 11 last year, so that's not terrible. And pretty much he's the type of player that I see, like, he knows that he doesn't score goals a lot, so he's going to try to do it in different ways. I see him score a lot of backhand goals, which is kind of weird for a defenseman to do. But he is intelligent enough that he can score goals without having that major shot that a guy like Cale Makar has, a guy like Josi has. So he's not going to be a goal-driving defenseman, but he is trending in the right direction, and nothing has really changed other than the fact that he's now making $9.5 million per season. But I don't necessarily see the money bag syndrome either, because he's kind of a different breed. He didn't come to New York for money. He came for the love of the team and the fact that he grew up rooting for them, and he took a bit of a discount at 9.5. So he's in the same defensive pairing with Ryan Lindgren. He's on the same power play. The only player that changed was Ryan Strome. That'll give an opportunity for either Trocheck or probably Lafreniere. One of those two will probably get power play one time. And that power play was top 5 in the league last year. So you're still getting an elite offensive producer. And I could even see him taking a jump from that .94 point per game last season, because he's been trending up every single season. And then, the other offensive juggernaut to talk about is Cale Makar. Makar sucks. He can't hold a candle to Adam Fox. He's completely dependent on McKinnon and Rantanen, and he should probably just retire. No, but seriously, he's probably the best defenseman in the league. And I'm an Adam Fox fan, so it hurts me to say that. But he is. He's the best. He had 28 goals last year, which blew everybody else out of the water. He's been trending in the right direction just the same way as Fox, but he has better numbers. 0.87 points per game, 1 point per game, and then 1.1 point per game average. If you're choosing between the two, obviously take Makar for the goals. And he even put up 1.23 hits per game and 1.4 blocks per game last year. So pretty well-rounded defenseman, and he's going to be drafted in the first round. So that's the only thing I would say is, if you want max value, you don't necessarily get Cale Makar just because he's going to be drafted in that first round. He might even go in the top 5 in your draft, because people know how rare he is and how much of a unicorn he is. And so they might reach very, very high to pick him. I got him last year at 12. He ended up, I think, at 13th at the end of the season, which was right about where you want to get him. If he's above that, then maybe just stick with one of the other guys. And then the other thing to mention, too, is he just went to the Stanley Cup Finals and won the Cup. And he's been, maybe partying a little bit in the offseason. So guys who usually go deep into the playoffs and have that kind of a run, they don't get as much of an offseason to recover. And maybe they don't care as much about the regular season production, but even him not caring about regular season production, I could still see him being over a point per game average defenseman, and very goal heavy at that. So just something to keep in mind with those two defensemen. Similarly, Quinn Hughes, he's in the same vein as those guys. They all came up at the same time. Similar progression to Fox and Makar, but a little bit less impressive. 0.77 points per game, 0.73 points per game, 0.89 last year. Very assist heavy, only 8 goals. He had 8 goals twice and 3 goals one season, so very assist heavy. But his numbers should be able to be maintained if the Bruce Boudreau effect can continue, and if the Canucks keep winning games. They're trending in the right direction. Last year, they once they made the coaching change, they were very good, and Quinn Hughes is still their power play quarterback. But if you're going to draft him, just make sure that you're not drafting him above any of the other guys that I just mentioned, like Josi, Ekblad, Makar, Fox, because he's just not going to get the same level of point production, and he's a little bit assist heavy as well. Another guy I wanted to mention as one of these young up-and-comers is Rasmus Dahlin. 0.66 last year, 0.57 5-year average, so not crazy overproduction by any stretch. 53 points in 80 games, and he's playing some of his best hockey now. 21 power play points. He's usually in that range for power play points. He had 20, 19, 11, and then 21 last year. On top of that, he had 1.5 hits per game, 1.1 blocks per game. So nothing to write home about, but his game is rounding into form, and Buffalo is improving every year. So if you've been sleeping on Rasmus Dahlin, he could be a good option deeper in the draft as a power play quarterback. because you're not going to think of Buffalo as an incredible power play, although they do have a lot of power play weapons. So he's a guy that you could look a little bit later in the draft to try to pick from. And speaking of power play production, we're going to look at Evan Bouchard. He had a .35 point per game average in his first season, and then a .53 in his second season. So not much of a sample size there. And he is pretty goal heavy. He had 12 goals last season, and he's exposed to maybe the best power play ever, especially early on last year. They were going at a historic pace, above 40%. But he only had 7 power play points last season, and his fantasy relevance will depend entirely on who plays top power play in Edmonton. If it's not him, then look to pick up Barry or Nurse, whoever's quarterbacking that power play. If it is him, he's going to get a bunch of shots, probably some goals, and a lot of power play points. And he doesn't necessarily have the name value of some of these other guys. So you might be getting exposure to a great power play, and you might not have to waste a high draft pick to do it, which might be the best value play, depending on where you can get him. And then another guy that I just wanted to talk about real quick, Thomas Chabot. I've been high on him since his rookie season, where he had 55 points in 70 games. If you look at his point per game numbers, .39, .78, .54, .63, and .64 in the last 5 seasons. And if you watch him, he absolutely has the capability to put up his best season yet. And technically, he's been trending in the right direction despite the rebuild in Ottawa. So he hasn't had much around him. Now he does. Now he's got DeBrincat, Giroux came in, Stützle's taken another step, and the top 6 rounds out with Tkachuk, Norris, and Batherson. So he's got offensive weapons to work with. He's going to have a much better power play to work with, and 2 bona fide scoring lines is a positive thing. And on top of that, he logs a ton of ice time. So just in terms of like probabilities, he's more likely to get a couple of hits and a couple of blocks per game if he's out there for 30, 35 minutes a game like he has in the past. He may not get that much ice time. You'd obviously prefer to limit him a little bit, but remember that one game he had almost 40 minutes of ice time when they had some injuries on their blue line, and that's absolutely insane. But I've been high on him for a couple of years, and it hasn't happened yet. I would expect, if there ever was a season for him to take a jump and become an elite power play quarterback who's very fantasy relevant, I would say it would happen this year. But that's just a hunch. And then the other guy to mention, Miro Heiskanen, not much of an overproduction. He's usually right around that mark. His point per game totals over the last 5 seasons, 0.4, 0.51, 0.49, 0.51. So he's right at that half a point per game mark. But that was without extensive power play one time. So now that John Klingberg has left, on paper, it looks like Heiskanen is due for a really excellent breakout season. He's more of an assist guy, though, so don't expect elite goal production. But the power play exposure helps because Dallas was ranked 11th last season on the power play. And you can just look at the eye test and see how talented this player is. And this might be the year where he could provide you excellent value. If you're looking for value in this list or in any of these lists that we do, trying to find defensemen at value, you're not going to find it with the elite guys like Makar, like Fox and Josi. I mean, you will find a little bit of value in the sense that you draft them at 20 or 25 and they maintain value and maybe don't slip past the 40 mark at the end rankings. But what you can do to increase your value is try to find guys who are primed for a breakout, like Miro Heiskanen, like Thomas Chabot. Some of these guys have already done it. Spurgeon, he's usually a safe option. Seth Jones, I wouldn't really go there just because of the what's unfolding in Chicago right now. Boquist could be an interesting option, though he's not going to get that much power play time. I would probably go to Werenski before him, but he is a goal-scoring defenseman. He had, I think, 11 goals last year in a limited amount of time. But that's the key, is you want to find a Dahlin or a Chabot or a Heiskanen, a guy who's going to be quarterbacking a pretty good power play and isn't showing up in the top upper echelon stat categories as you're in your draft. So a lot of people, they're in their draft, they're just looking at last year's statistics, and they'll see the guys like Josi, they'll see Ekblad and Fox at almost a point per game average, Makar well over a point per game, and they'll try to reach and get those guys. And there is a reason to do that, and we've covered that in the 2 elite defensemen video. But at the same time, you do want to filter in a lot of value, and the way that you can do that is finding these guys who are primed and ready for a breakout season. And we will do a little bit more of this in the buy low defenseman video that will be coming in the next couple of days. But not all of these guys have been trending in the right direction compared to some of these younger players on this list. And again, as I mentioned before, the guys more towards the bottom of this list are not necessarily drastically overproducing their numbers. Some of this has to do with limited sample size, and some of this has to do with the increase in scoring for last season. But just to quickly, if I can summarize without pulling up the data again, overdraft candidates are less likely to underperform if they're younger and have trended in the right direction. Now, we went over some of those today, and hopefully you can look at those guys to find value for your elite defenseman. But you still need to use the strategy that I've been trying to advise you with of drafting 2 elite defensemen. And you need to keep that strategy in mind when you were looking at that data. So if you do, you're probably more likely to fill in what you need on your team as opposed to just picking a player because you like him or don't like him or whatever happened, whatever you thought about the data. Oh, this guy didn't look good. This guy did look good. It's all relative to where you're going to draft him and what strategy you're going to use. So you absolutely should combine what you learned in this video with a strategy. And if you don't have one, you can check out my strategy videos in the playlist on my channel. You can just head on over to my channel. Rule number 2 is draft 2 elite defensemen, and rule number 4 has to do with hits and blocks defensemen. So yeah, just wanted to thank you guys again for your continued support. I've been getting a lot of comments and feedback on potential videos to do. I'll be taking that into account. I already have probably 4 or 5 videos lined up. Just need to get the time to do the analysis for that and put together the videos. But yeah, if you like this type of content, leave a like, a comment, subscribe. But also, share this with some people that you might know that could get value out of this as well. Any little bit helps. I'm trying to grow the channel a little bit and help you guys as we get closer to fantasy draft season. And another thing, I will be doing a bunch of mock drafts. I just got a request to do a pretty unique mock draft on an auction type of drafting system. So as long as I can, make that happen, I'll be doing a bunch of mock drafts. And the purpose of those mock drafts will be trying to illustrate the strategy to use as opposed to just, which players I'm going to pick. If there's any takeaway that you can take away from my channel is that it doesn't matter as much who you draft. It matters where you draft them, and it matters that you have a strategy. So just keep that in the back of your mind. But thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.